Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Institute for Government. I'm Jill Rutter, I'm Programme Director here, and welcome to either the 9th in our ever-expanding Women Leaders series that the IFG is putting on in partnership with Ernst & Young, or indeed the first of our new series. So this is hopefully a very timely panel. We thought it would be interesting to look at the way in which women politicians, women's issues might fare in election 2015. There's been quite a lot of sort of work on the role of women in broadcasting, the underrepresentation of women in broadcasting, and one of the people who's been a sort of big mover in exposing quite a lot of that is my long-standing friend, Professor Suzanne Franks from City University. So rather than have an inexpert chairing from me, we have asked Suzanne to chair it today, so I'm going to hand over, without further ado, to Suzanne, who will then introduce the panellists, and we're going to run to 1:45. Hopefully there'll be loads of time for questions, as always, so thank you very much for coming. I know it's a very pressured time in Whitehall as the government seeks to move through to the announcement of the election and the kick-off, the starting gun next week, so thank you all very much for making the time to come today. So, without further ado, Professor Suzanne Franks.
Second. Thanks. Thank you very much indeed for inviting us here today, Jill. It's a great topic. We've got a really good panel talking about it. This is something very close to my heart. I did a report on women in journalism last year for the Reuters Institute, and I was also involved in this House of Lords report that came out earlier this year on women in news and current affairs. But it's particularly interesting to talk about it now at the time of the election, when the last election, as I'm sure you're all aware, there was a lot of criticism for the way that women were portrayed and the way that women were reporting or not reporting on the election. So, as I say, we've got a brilliant panel. And also not just great individuals, but it's good that we've covered a whole sort of multimedia range in our panel. So on my left here, I've got Beth Rigby, who's now the Deputy Political Editor of the FT. She's been at the FT for many years, covered all sorts of things from hedge funds to retail, whatever. She was Chief Political Correspondent, and she's now the Deputy Political Editor. She's also, interestingly, Chair of the Lobby at the moment, which means she's got a good perspective on this from sitting in Westminster. And she also tells me she's the only mother in the lobby, which I thought was very interesting.
In the daily
in the daily newspaper lobby, yeah. So turning to broadcasting, Laura Kuenssberg is, I suppose, the veteran on this panel in terms of reporting politics. She was the only one who was... No, I only meant in political terms, yes. She was reporting on the 2010 election, so she can give an interesting perspective and comparison from that. She's been was at the BBC for many years, did all sorts of roles again, sort of local radio, moved her way up to become Chief Political Correspondent. She then had a shortish spell at ITN from 2011 to 2014 when she was the business correspondent, and since last year she's been back again, lured back to the BBC, and she's presenter and chief correspondent on Newsnight. Then perhaps the most sort of cutting edge then of our panelists, I suppose, is the web representative here, who is Anoosh Chakelian. She's the deputy editor of the New Statesman website, and previously she was at totalpolitics.com. Is it totalpolitics.com? No, yeah. She was on the magazine and the Total Politics website. So we cover a great range here. So what I'm going to do is ask each of them to give their perspective very briefly to start with, and then we will throw it open to you to have a discussion and ask questions. So Beth, so who's going to go first? You're going to go first? Yeah. Beth,
I'll go first. Okay. I've got 3 points to make about this. I suppose the first point is the political point about how important will women be in this election. And I think what we've seen, now I didn't cover the 2010 election, so I'll be interested in what Laura says about this, but certainly in terms of how Labour are positioning, Harriet Harman definitely has a desire to put women front and centre stage of at least the Labour campaign. So they've got their pink bus, which I'm sure you've all seen the coverage of, but underneath it is a serious point, which is the point that 9 million women did not vote in the 2010 election against I think it was 1.1 million more than men not voting. So what they're saying is there's a big gender gap in voting. Women can hold the balance of power, and what politicians need to do is try and mobilise that vote. And so they're off around the country in their pink bus. Why are Labour doing that? Well, actually, when you look at polling, Labour are about 3 percentage points ahead of the Tories with women. There was some really interesting polling for Populous for the FT, which showed that Labour were 20 percentage points ahead with mothers, which is extraordinary, but kind of maybe speaks to the cost of living squeeze that Labour talks about, that often gets a short shrift within the newspapers, but actually maybe underlying that, how people are feeling, that's reflected in perhaps that disparity. The other thing is that they think that they have an advantage in marginal seats, and Gloria Del Piero, who's their shadow women's minister, did some work last summer. It might be a bit out of date, but their argument was in 34 out of 38 key Labour battlegrounds, they have a lead with women, and in 26 of those seats, they've got a 10 percentage point lead. So there is a practical reason why Labour are targeting women. It could be seen as quite cynical because it's maybe their only hope, but anyway. On the Tory side, there's a nervousness about this. I mean, Labour are putting out a women's manifesto. The Tories are having some discussion about should they do that or not. They're quite split about how to do that. So that's a sort of political backdrop. I think the second issue is, and an issue that might come out after the election, is how women are represented in Parliament. We know that 23% of politicians are female. The Tory side, it's 16%, Labour, it's 31%, the Lib Dems, it's about 7 out of 57. The Women in Boards report by Mervyn Davies is coming out tomorrow, and female representation at the top of professions in our Parliament is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. And I think after the election, when we look at where the Conservatives end up, when we look at where Labour end up, for the Tories this I think will be a big issue. The Electoral Reform Society think that 1 in 5 Conservative MPs will be female after the election based on their predictions. The Lib Dems could end up with 1 female MP because they are obviously facing quite serious losses potentially, and all their female MPs are actually in marginal seats. And I think that's quite shocking for a party that was in coalition this time around to end up returning 1 woman to Parliament. So I think representation in Parliament is another theme of this election. And also, what do the Tories do after the election? Do they actually say we need to do all women shortlists, we need to set a target, or do they just insist that incremental change is enough? And then the third issue is who covers the election. And in terms of the newspaper lobby where I work, in the daily newspaper lobby, this might not be quite accurate, but I did a little check of all the names, and I worked out that about 19% of journalists in the parliamentary lobby on daily newspapers are female. There's no female political editors, and the women that are in the lobby tend to be the more junior members on the team. They're young women, they're the number 4 or 5 on the team. So the point I'm making, or just the observation, is that in terms of the people that drive the news agenda, certainly from the newspapers, within the parliamentary lobby, are not necessarily female, and they come from quite a narrow group of very experienced and able, male, older, white journalists. I'm not suggesting, or I don't know the answer about whether or not that means that there's bias in reporting, but I'm just pointing out to you that there's an issue in who is covering. So they're my point, you know, the political backdrop, women in Parliament, and then women in the media. I think they're the big sort of themes of the election from my perspective.
Great, thank you very much indeed. Anush, do you want to get...
Yes, I want to pick up on some of Beth's points about how many women are covering this election and how many women in political journalism that there are, because I know that the lobby is a very male-dominated place, but actually online we've got this rise of feminist bloggers, particularly on the New Statesman website and elsewhere, who haven't always specifically covered politics, but they are now mainly because the election is coming up and it's topical. But also, I feel like that kind of writing is holding our politicians more to account on the representation in Parliament issue. So you had both David Cameron and Ed Miliband feeling very pressured to promote lots of women to their front benches, and that's what they both did in their most recent reshuffles. And so actually I do think that there is a reason to be optimistic about coverage of this election, because there's a whole new range of voices particularly online, but also I've seen a lot more women on TV as well. I don't know the numbers, but on Sky News, BBC, Channel 4, you're having more and more women who are presenting these politics programmes and becoming household names. So actually, when I look at what this election looks like compared to when I started out in politics, which was not that long ago, it's only 3 or 4 years ago, I'm more optimistic than when I started then. And when I started then, I was working on a magazine, a sort of in-housey magazine called Total Politics, and I had a lobby pass, and I was based in the lobby. And I remember one of the first things quite a senior male journalist said to me. It was just before my first conference season, and he was sort of lamenting the fact that women have a much better time at conference because they get stories easier. And I said, what do you mean? He went, well, you can sleep with anyone you like. And I was just, and I'd never been to party conference before, and I was just like, oh gosh. And now I really don't think, I can't imagine anyone saying that to me now. Maybe it was because I was young, I don't know. But I thought that was an appalling comment, and I was like, what have I got myself into? But actually, I feel like things have got better. So, there are obviously still problems. But and also, we've got these people who are going to be in the TV debates. There are more women, Nicola Sturgeon, Natalie Bennett, Leanne Wood. So there are actually more high-profile women that are going to be covered in the lead-up to the election as well. So that's a good thing too.
Great. Okay, thanks very much. Well, I'm glad to hear you're more optimistic. Things have changed so radically. Laura?
I think probably my position is somewhere in between the two of you in a sense, although I have to say I'm delighted to be described as a veteran at 38. I was thinking that actually either at this event someone's going to commit the terrible cardinal sin of saying, well, that's very feisty, because there are feisty women who do rather well. It's just a shame about the others. But being a veteran at 38, maybe I can look back to the 2010 election and do a bit of a sort of compare and contrast. I mean, at the outset, whether we're talking about representation in Parliament, the representation on air, online, or in the print lobby, I think it's naive to pretend that it's equitable, or to say that in any sense it's an accurate mirror of the country that we live in. So that's the big picture. However, if I cast my mind back to the last time around, and I remember day after day, you look right one way up Downing Street, you look left up the other way up Downing Street, man, 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 man. Similarly, the TV debates were all fronted by men the last time, and the big, crunchy, hard politics was most of the time, with some notable exceptions of people who had been in government, whether that was Harriet Harman or Yvette Cooper. There were women with senior jobs in the previous government, but most of the discourse, most of the gladiatorial combat of the last election was carried out by men, whether that's journalists, parliamentarians, or commentators. However, this time round, it does feel a bit different. If we think of the debates, Julie Etchingham, Kay Burley, who would be brave enough to argue that they are not very tough, distinguished journalists who will be more than capable of holding their own. They are both being front and centre in the debates. In terms of the programme that I work on, for example, our political coverage is led by women. Our political editor is Allegra Stratton. I work on the programme. Kirsty Wirt works on the programme. Emily Maitlis works on the programme. Again, is anyone going to argue that that team is not able to hold people to account and is not somehow prominent, being on the BBC's flagship nightly current affairs programme? Take Channel 4 News, our dear rivals. Cathy Newman, Jackie Long, they weren't doing that job 5 years ago. Again, is anyone going to argue that they're not able to hold people to account, that they're somehow not visible in this campaign? And in terms also of, I think, two groups that we sometimes forget about in this discussion, commentators are quite often not included. People like Rachel Sylvester, Alice Thompson, Camilla Cavendish, getting great stories, generating really good, important debates. And if you think of some of the issues, particularly that Camilla has brought to the fore, whether they're strictly political stories or not, there are women who are doing very serious work that is taken seriously by people in Parliament, and therefore their work has real impact. And another group that I think we often ignore, and I think maybe sometimes we bemoan the lack of equity too much and we focus on the negative. I don't want to sound sort of Pollyanna-ish, but the people who actually run some of these programs, for example, in the BBC, the head of political programs is a woman. The person who runs the political news gathering operation at Millbank is a woman. The head of the Westminster news desk at ITV is a woman. So the kind of executives who are running bits of the very important machines and making many of the day-to-day decisions are often, sometimes, women. The idea that it is a very, very binary debate, I think, is sometimes not very helpful and I have to say, not that accurate. But do I say that it's an accurate mirror of the country that we live in? Absolutely not. Is it sometimes difficult to be a woman in the lobby? Absolutely yes. Do I think someone might not say what they said to you a few years ago? I think probably some people still would say those kinds of things. You know, I'm sure I'm not the only one here who's had the most jaw-dropping thing said to me over the last 10 years, and I wouldn't think that that particular element of what goes on has changed very much. But I do think there has been a little bit of progress. One thing I think is worth saying, which is it can be frustrating. At Newsnight, for example, we start every day trying to get not necessarily a 50-50 quota, but trying to end up with a balanced program in terms of the guests who appear live and the guests who are in our reports. It's very, very, very difficult to do. We're not saying we've got a solution to that, but it's worth acknowledging that. Again, it's easy to say, well, people who are making programs or writing or whatever don't take it seriously enough. When you try, and you try very hard, it's not always easy to achieve.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, that's given us quite a lot to think of, and also that's quite interesting, the way that Laura's been able to contrast the sort of whole tone of 2010 and what she sees as the sort of emerging, the way that the debates are going to be framed, not just the election debates, but the wider debate is going to be framed, and who's going to be asked. Just one thing that none of you have mentioned, which I wanted to raise first. What about the sort of entry of UKIP and the kind of UKIP tone now, which is a very kind of Boise sort of, and do you think that's changed anything? I mean, that's you know, you talked about the Greens and Nicola Sturgeon and so on, but what about the sort of UKIP element?
I'm not sure that makes much difference to the sort of a gender aspect. I mean, I think one of the very interesting things we're seeing in this election, or you can make a very good argument that this election is the first election in this country that's a sort of beginning, we're starting to see a beginning of a culture war, in the same way that happened in the States. So if you think what happened post-Clinton, it ends up, you know, liberal becomes a dirty word, all that kind of stuff. We hear Farage and the SNP using the word elite a lot. And so I'm not sure that's a gender issue, but I think there is a difference in the debate, and you can make a quite an interesting argument, which I'm not making very well at the moment. But this election is the beginning of that kind of cultural battle, which we haven't really seen in this way before, that's moved beyond sort of broad ideologies of left and right.
My observation about Farage coming into the debate and becoming much more prominent is that my concern about that is that he makes remarks, he makes things that people might think but know too well better not to say, totally permissible. And I'm thinking about the remarks he made about women in the city deserving to be paid less because they have a relational job where they have relationships with clients, and then they inconveniently have a baby and they might be away from their job, and that makes them a less valuable employee, okay? Or you think about his comments about breastfeeding, where he said, well, you know, really you should go to the corner of the room. Now, I don't know any woman who's breastfed that sort of wants to sit in the middle of the room and say, look, everyone, watch what I'm doing. I mean, it's just, and so that's my observation about UKIP, is that sometimes I think that they kind of pull us back to a sort of 1980s type Britain where you think we've got over that now, and that debate shut down, and let's move on to other things like gender equality in pay and gender equality on boards and gender equality in Parliament, and then you find you're having to fight 2-decade-old battles. That's my concern over that.
No, I was going to agree about the remarks that he made about breastfeeding. Imagine if one of the party leaders, imagine if David Cameron or Ed Miliband said something like that. You're right, he says the things that are unacceptable, but he makes them acceptable. I don't know whether, just as a person on his own, he would be able to drag all of our politicians back to being able to say the unsayable. But I do think that he sometimes distracts from a debate which I thought that we'd all, you know, that was already progressing, and that we were talking about more important more important things now, and that we've moved on from just sort of straight up sexism.
Okay, so can I open it out now? Do you want, are there any questions that you are burning to ask, or shall I? You need a microphone because we're recording this. So can you wait till the microphone actually reaches you, and then can you say who you are and where you're from? So this gentleman here first of all.
From Kensington. How would the coverage of the election differ if a higher proportion of women were covering it in the media?
I'm not very sure. It might not differ at all. It might differ very greatly, because I do think that the sort of attributes and personality and hard work and efforts and scoops of individual journalists is much more important than what their gender is. That's my view. I mean, I think it would look different to viewers. My personal hope is it might make more of our audiences or more readers more engaged in what they see and read, because they see more back somebody who looks like them, and therefore it's an easier, more comfortable, more accessible product. But it might not differ very much at all, you know.
So Beth, do you think it would make difference that the 9 million women who don't vote, would it make a difference there, for example?
I would say, going back to Laura's point about the broadcasters and the gender balance, that there are two very different things that go on in media vis-a-vis gender balance. Now, with broadcasters, you cannot have just men presenting.
We did for a very long time.
It's not,
when I was now wouldn't be seen as acceptable.
You're going into people's homes on television. You need to somehow represent, or try to represent a little bit, who those people are that you're talking to. So I think the difference with papers is it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if 90% of your bylines in a paper are male. No one notices. That's the first point I'd make. The second point I'd make in terms of does it make any difference? I agree with Laura, I don't know. But what I would say is that there are certain themes that may be of subject matter that may be of interest in, say, the parliamentary lobby, and that gets whipped up a bit. And I'm thinking, for example, the argument about 2% defence spending. Do you ring fence it? Don't you ring fence it? It might be, I mean, I don't know if this is the right answer, and I'd love someone to do some research on this, but it might be that there's certain areas that are interesting to a certain group of people, and then there are other areas, and polling does show that, for example, there are differences. I hate bunching women in as like some, big mass, because they're very different people, but, polling does show that women are much more concerned about the NHS, for example, than men. Now, you could argue, is there enough coverage of that particular election concern within the coverage, or do we all talk about the economy and macroeconomics? And certainly Conservative women that I talk to about the way the campaign is working, what they say is, we get that we're doing the long-term economic plan, we get the kind of macroeconomic message, but the language of the campaign doesn't drill down into, okay, and this is why it should matter to you and your family, so that the rationale, the reasoning is good, but the emotion isn't there, and the emotion that potentially reaches out to win voters. So I don't know the answer, but I think that when there's quite a narrow group of people, certainly in the newspapers setting the agenda, maybe that does lead to certain subjects getting more attention than others.
But interestingly, there was actually research done in the States about this, and it did show that they looked at sort of news agendas and stories covered, and there is some evidence they took a couple of newsrooms where there are predominantly women, and they showed that there was actually a different, I mean, not hugely, but things like the HPV vaccine and that kind of thing were getting more coverage in those kinds of newsrooms. So there was a little bit at the margins for showing that you might have a slightly different priority in terms of what stories you choose to cover.
Yeah, I think the focus might change slightly, because the coalition spending decisions have hit women 4 times harder than men. That's usually a story, and it's just as much the onus of politicians to put that story out there as it is the journalists, I think. It's usually relegated to the Harriet Harman questioning Nick Clegg about it in the one time that the deputies stand in PMQs, or the shadow Treasury front bench team on Labour, they put their women out to tell that story. They don't make it their chief spending, their chief criticism of the coalition's cuts. And you have UKIP, for example, worrying about how working class communities that have been left behind in certain areas of the country have been hit by the spending decisions, but they don't, that story about the women who have actually been hit particularly hard isn't always told. So I do think if there were more women in newsrooms, then maybe that would get more of a focus, but I think you need the politicians to reflect that as well.
Okay, where's the microphone? Yeah, okay.
Thank you. I'm Claire Pelham. I'm Chief Exec of Leonard Cheshire, which is a disability charity. And if I may, I'd like to contribute to the previous point and ask a question. So we employ about 8,000 women, and anecdotally, an awful lot of them are not going to vote. And when we have discussions about why, because social care is a huge political issue, what they say, often indirectly, is that's a load of men deciding how life is going to be for us. And so I do think it's at least possible that if you had better mix in terms of people, both sides, in terms of politicians and in terms of journalists, that it would feel more impactful for the women who don't presently feel included. My question is, I wonder to what extent, if at all, when you're seeking to have gender balance in people you go to, you feel there's any self-censorship the other side of the line. And the reason I ask that is I'm chairman of an umbrella body, and I've observed a couple of times, particularly with out-of-hours inquiries, coming from a good place, but still sexist in its effect, we didn't come to Jane because we know she's a mother, she'll have been up late, she won't want to go to Salford at that hour, or. So coming from a kindness, it was going to be tough, we know that, we thought that'd be difficult for you, that there's a degree of self-censorship sometimes in comms teams that I worry about, and that perhaps we all need to look inwards at our own organisations and say, bring it on a bit more. Actually, the reason I do this job is I can take it.
So are you saying that it's the comms teams are not putting you forward, or is that the journalists are saying, we won't bother her?
No, the comms teams, I'm not speaking from my own organisation now, but I observe that comms teams are sometimes protective of senior women in a way that they're not protective of senior men.
That's interesting. That's really interesting, because we've done this research at City on expert women, where we log every week with students who's actually giving the expert opinion on different news programs. And I don't know if you've seen it, but there's never more than, it's always a 1-to-4 ratio is the kind of, that's the best it gets. I mean, it's 1-to-6. But that's one, and a lot of, when you actually go and talk to them and why they don't, they said, we asked endless, like Laura said, we asked endless women, it's always, I don't quite know enough, and, I don't really want to speak out on this, and, it's often not for want of I think the journalists try, but I've never actually heard it from that side.
What I suspect happens is that they don't ask the woman, they ask the
press
officer who says,
I
she wouldn't be able to, or she couldn't, or she has young children, or.
Laura, what do you think?
That's a very interesting point, and I suspect that probably does happen. But what also does sometimes happen, which actually never, I still find really staggering, is that when something is after hours, there's always just either people don't get back to you in a comms team, or I'm sure your comms team is excellent, without fault in any way, shape or form. But it's a very, very, very fast-paced, moving industry, and quite often you need a bum on seat, and it still surprises me that sometimes comms teams after hours it's all too difficult, and we can't get anyone, and which is fine. That's their choice. But I think sometimes we get quite a lot of kickback on, particularly on social media, for who we have on, with this sort of assumption that we could have anybody we wanted if only we'd bothered to ask. And because things move very, very quickly, quite often we're really not in that position at all. But that's a very interesting point, and I think sometimes it does happen with female politicians. That also they are less willing sometimes. I have to be very careful with what I say here. Sometimes you find female politicians are less willing, for very good reasons, that they're maybe more they're more keen to be getting back to see their kids on a Thursday night than their male colleagues might be. And that's often true. It's not always true, but it's often true. And I think it's silly not to be able to say that. And
I think that's
I think
a
that's a
huge
big deal.
issue. I mean, I get asked to do quite a lot of broadcast, and I do some, and I turn a load down. And the reason I turn a load down, I mean, I had 3 requests to do 2 lots of radio for yesterday, something on Sky. I was like, look, I've done broadcast all weekend. I've got 2 little kids. I want to go home and see my kids. And I was speaking to a producer on a news channel. She said to me that she will, at the weekend, phone 20 women, and they will all say no because so-and-so's having lunch, or there's a party, or I'm hosting this. And then the first guy she phones goes, yeah, I'll do it. I'm going to drop the lunch, I'm going to go and I'll come back, I'll be half an hour, no progs. Yeah. And I
that's because he's not making the lunch.
Yeah, but I actually think this is a serious issue, and I think I don't think the broadcasters, the last thing that Ian Katz wants on Newsnight is 3 blokes all having a conversation. It looks really bad. I mean, they wouldn't want that. But actually, if you look, we were talking about the better gender representation in broadcasting. Certainly in the press lobby, there is a handful of women that you could pick out to get to go and do that. So you've got a smaller pool of people to pick from. You've got a pool of people that have other constraints on their time that maybe they're not as willing to do it. And then you've got the great commentators like Camilla and Rachel, and you can pull from that pool as well. But I just think there's a smaller pool, and I actually do think women, well, in my experience, I think they're less willing to do it because they're like, you know what, I don't want to work 18 hours because I've got other things I want to do. It's really difficult.
Yeah, I mean, that was, I think, certainly the case with the, this expert women group that was set up after there was all this complaints about how few women women are appearing, that there was, you've got to work harder and harder to get a woman. So it's quite interesting to hear all these.
Yeah, I mean, I would really emphasise that from the broadcaster's point of view, it is really not for want of trying.
No.
And also, you're starting off of a base of having 23% of female MPs to 78 of men, and probably the Tories and Labour, I'm sure, have a group of people that they will release out to do these things, and it might be that there's even a smaller percentage of women in that group.
Yeah. That's hard work.
Interesting. Okay, there's lots more hands up. Yes?
Right. Thank you very much. John Newman with a question on the first television debate in 48 hours' time. Now, my understanding is that the style will be for Jeremy Paxman to interview both Ed Miliband and David Cameron, and then Kay Burley will do the audience area of the programme. Now, my question is quite simply, notwithstanding Paxman's, shall we say, reputation for being tough, Kay Burley is not exactly a shrinking violet even. I just wonder, would it make any difference if they did it the other way around, with Kay Burley doing the interrogation and Paxman doing the studio audience? One other very quick point. Any comment from anybody on the appointment of the new editor of The Guardian? I'm not quite sure when she's taking the post up, but quite soon, presumably. Thanks very much.
Yeah, first woman in 194 years or something. Laura, do you want to answer that? Since
I think on the Sky Channel 4 debate, I'm not sure exactly how they are going to use the format. I know that Sky and Channel 4, I'm sure they will have endlessly thought about it with great care. They'll have put huge effort and attention into how it's going to work. Kay and Jeremy are both formidable interviewers, and I think however they do it, it won't be a dull watch. And I'm not entirely sure what the interaction will be both between the two of them and the audience questioners and the others. So I think it will be a great watch. I know they'll have thought about it very carefully. And would it be different? Of course it would be different if they mixed up, if they did it one way and the other, of course it would be different. But would it be any less tough? I doubt it. And on The Guardian, it's great to have a female editor of a national daily. And I'm not going to say anything else on that.
And The Economist just got their first editor.
The Economist, yes, don't forget The Economist. Yes, first
yeah,
again
of course.
in hundreds of years.
Zani.
Yeah. Have you got anything? Do you want to add to that at all, Beth?
I haven't really got anything to add on the debates because I think, as you said, I think Kay will do a great job and Jeremy will do a great job, and I think they're kind of totally equals, and they'll handle it really well. On the appointment of Kath Viner, it's great news, and she won the popular vote in the paper, so it shows democracy's alive and kicking at the Guardian. She won 53% of the vote. I think she's the fast broadsheet editor of the Daily.
Yeah. Well, for 3 months, Janet Street Porter edited the Independent,
okay.
for 3 months in 1996.
But certainly the FT,
yes.
The Times, the
Yeah,
Daily
no,
Tell
she is definitely.
have had a female editor, so, you know, good on her.
Next. Sorry. Oh, yes, here, front row.
Hello, my name's Miranda Green and I'm a sort of pundit. And I used to work with Beth on the FT for many years. So I'm delighted to see Beth here in such an elevated position now. My question actually is about Laura referred to this question of sort of elite becoming a term of abuse and the general sort of anti-politics mood, because I was very interested at the amount of coverage that the new Alison Wolfe book got, which is this theory that there's now a sort of super class of women who've kind of flown above and joined the men and outsource everything inconvenient like the children, the elderly, all of those traditional female responsibilities, and play the male game on male terms, and the rest of the female population kind of left behind. And I think that's a big issue with this election, because it seems to me there are very successful female politicians. I'm worried that they just get seen in the same way as the male politicians, and that there is this, you know, underpaid, stressed section of the female population in insecure employment, on 0 hours contracts, whatever it is, with all these caring responsibilities. Will they look at the new politics, even though I agree, actually, very much that a massive improvement has happened in the last 5 years in terms of the visibility of the female gender in politics and commenting on it. But what do you think about this? Because this worries me slightly, you know, that you see some women manage to break in, but do the female population see them as representing their interests? And does that matter? Maybe it doesn't matter. I think it does, but maybe it doesn't.
Anush, do you want to
People on low pay in this country, 60% of them are women. Yeah. So it's certainly a problem. And then you have these politicians who have broken the mould and made it to the top of politics, like Harriet Harman, who, as soon as she tries to do something on women's issues, which was supposed to address the experience of ordinary women around the country, she went around the country in this minibus. It was, I mean, on the day of that story breaking, it was completely overshadowed by the idea that the bus was patronising because it was pink and it looked a bit silly. But actually, as soon as politicians do stick their neck out, female politicians do stick their neck out and do things like this in the hope of helping ordinary people, in the hope of looking like they care about ordinary women, we do tend to shoot them down. I think journalists, not just male journalists, but everyone is responsible for actually looking at the story beneath what may have been, you know, quite a silly colour or whatever, like that. And then I think your point also ties into this debate that I think some people in the Labour Party are having. We're doing sort of a bit of reporting on this at the moment, in that there are those MPs from working class backgrounds, men and women in the Labour Party, who sometimes have this critique of feminism and feminists on the left, saying, well, you know, it's dominated by middle class women, and this is at the expense of working class people. And Harriet Harman is very forthright about that argument. She thinks it's an anti-feminist argument, and she doesn't see that you have to. She doesn't accept that you should divide people on those kind of levels. Inequality is inequality, and you should fight inequality as a whole rather than separating people into their own categories. But it is a problem that the Labour Party, particularly because on the left you have more of these conversations going on, need to address, because they are losing their working class representation. Ed Miliband's whole problem is that he's seen as a sort of Hampstead, liberal, and so they do need to try and reconcile people like Harriet, who are doing great things feminism-wise, with the people who feel that that's distracting from other people who have been left behind in society. So I do think it's an argument that's going to blow up at some stage, I think.
But do you want to talk about the Alison Wolfe point?
I think this comes back to the 30% club. I think it comes back to the issue of representation, and that I've actually just done a magazine piece which is going into the FT, just buy it, this weekend about the whole issue of women in Parliament. And I interviewed over 25 peers, SPADs, MPs about it. And what kept coming back, and I spoke to Lucy Powell, for example, who's now running the Labour campaign, and she said, yeah, I could be a minister, but the whole Whitehall machine wouldn't let me live my life how I want to live my life, i.e. go back up to Manchester on Thursday to see her 3 kids. You know, Maria Miller says the reason women are failing to thrive in Parliament isn't just because they're female, it's because it's a male-dominated culture. And I think what's happening, what Alison's referring to is the fact that these women who get right to the top somehow have to work in a male culture, and that sets the parameters of how you have to behave and how far you have to go. And there's not enough, it's like crowdsource, there's not enough women there to begin to change that culture. And I think you're right, it's really worrying, because then if the only women that other women see are women that have, you know, nannies and da-da-da, and they, you know, they're dressed in fine clothes and they're not having to do the, you know, scrub the kitchen floor, then maybe they don't relate to them. But I think that, I hope that over the next generation that will change, because if you get critical mass in Parliament, you can begin to change the way it operates, and maybe you can begin to present yourself in a slightly different way, and it won't harm your ambition or limit your chances.
Yeah, but there is an issue, isn't there, that fewer and fewer working class people are going to Parliament anyway, aside from gender.
The issue about those, that's the sort of, the UCL are doing a parliamentary audit at the moment about who's going into Parliament. And I think it was something like 4% of MPs now are from manual backgrounds, compared with, I mean, it was maybe double digits 10, 15 years ago. That's a real problem. I don't know the solution to that. I think, given the way in which the Tory women I interviewed that were trying to do candidate selection said the big problem, say, with getting women to become politicians is just they hate the scrutiny that their families get in the press. And if you're a businesswoman, if you're an economist, if you're a lawyer, you can have a professional career and a private life. And if you're a politician, it's a free-for-all on anything about your life. And this was Sarah Newton, who's in charge of candidate selection. She said that loads of women, particularly with children, you know, I don't want to keep labouring that, but said they just don't want to do it. There's a really interesting fact, like, in the wider population, 4 out of 5 adult women have children. In Parliament, 2 out of 5 female politicians have children.
Yeah, that says a lot, yeah.
It says a lot about how it works.
I just want to say two things briefly. One, I think that sense of dislocation is much wider than a gender thing. The other thing, though, what makes me slightly sad, I suppose, about that critique is, again, we have then the potential that you get one load of women being encouraged to basically slag off another load of women for doing something really amazing but not doing it in quite the right way. You know, no, I know you're not, but I'm
actually agree with her analysis.
Yeah.
I just think it's interesting how much coverage it
yeah.
got.
Yeah.
And bearing in mind this general dislocation, how worried are you about it?
Yeah. The other thing I just think on all of this, so there's one tool that people have now in a way that they certainly didn't have 5 years ago. And if you see, slightly off the point, but it goes back to the pink bus, which actually I think Labour couldn't have dreamt of the fantastic publicity they got for that bus. They couldn't. It was everywhere. And if there hadn't been a row over the silly colour, nobody would have known. And it would have turned up in supermarket car parks around the country and had a bit of an impact. It had a huge impact, and every day it's going everywhere. So, you know, not everybody in the party was upset about that being a row. After all, maybe we might even wonder if they even knew they might paint a silly colour. They might end up getting a bit of stick that could have ended up with some coverage. But the one sort of tool that people have at their disposal now, which they just didn't have in the same way in 2010, is social media and calling people out when things happen that are pretty unpleasant. So the Sun's spread of Nicola Sturgeon a la Miley Cyrus on a wrecking ball in a tartan bikini, they got a whole lot of stick for doing that. Now, it's not going to stop them doing it. I'm sure they'll do similar things again. But there's a comeback now that people can use. And some things have happened about, you know, unfortunately, one of the things about doing the job I do is that you get a huge amount of stick about what you look like, what you wear, what you say, that male people on air just do not get. And some of it is really unpleasant. And some of it appears in august publications. But what's interesting is on social media, you sometimes get people really sticking up for you, which doesn't make it less unpleasant. And of course, the answer is not to read anything or ever read anything or ever look at what people say about you on Twitter. But there's a comeback now that exists in a small way that wasn't there 5 years ago.
That's interesting because you don't often hear that perspective. We hear all the time that, you know, social media can be so poisonous, particularly to women and sort of like, but I suppose then there's the kind of...
Well, it's a megaphone, isn't it?
Yeah.
I always think social media is a megaphone, so whatever the nastiness is amplified a million times, and the pleasant, some aspects of the pleasant supportiveness of it is also amplified a million times. But you know, it's a kind of megaphone on acid where the news, the news cycle is almost going to eat itself because rows will flare up and then disappear within 30 seconds, and somebody's reacted to a story before it's happened. But it's invigorating and exciting in lots of ways. But it's a megaphone. It's not a negative or a positive. It just massively amplifies the best and the worst of human behaviour.
Yeah, but then women often get the sort of the brunt of that. I mean, there was some quite interesting.
Oh yeah, certainly.
You know, in the Obama campaign, Candy Crowley, who was the only has been the only female ever to do a presidential debate in the States. But I think she's CNN. What happened on social media after that, and that was already some years ago when social media was quite extraordinary. I mean, about what she looked like and her figure and her clothes and everything, which, you know, no man who's ever done a presidential debate has ever had that kind of attention.
The stuff that we get is hideous, and some of it really explicit and appalling.
No, but it's nice to see that you say that there is a sort of then the back's left.
A little bit.
Okay, right. Do you with the mic?
I work in social media.
What's your name?
Linda Davidson. I mentor a lot of young women into the digital industries, and something that they are usually under 24, quite a small sample size for what I'm about to say, but they are quite adamant that there should be quotas for women working. And I just wondered what the panel felt about that.
Actually, do you want, Vicky, do you want to, because I know you've just written a book on quotas for women, haven't you, as well?
Yeah, so Vic, I've just written a book called Why Women Need Quotas, but the interesting thing for it is I don't really care about the words at all. It's really just thinking about Miranda's point and Alison Wolfe, which is what you need to do, in my view, is have role models in senior positions more generally, who then, if you have those quotas, then you end up with the organisation, wherever you are, whether it's politics or elsewhere, having to adjust this culture to allow for different types of women, different types of working practices to be there, and encourages everyone to come up as well, rather than just thinking there's a bit of an elite at the top, which is a real problem. So I have to say that I completely agree. And the interesting thing is that a number of quite public figures, including Barbara Thomas, who until recently was saying, loads of people saying, now saying yes, please, because everything's moving so slowly.
Barbara Thomas,
lady judge who now runs, who's now chair of the Institute of Directors, which is quite interesting, and also Fiona Woolf, who said, I think
in the interview with the FT,
that yes, we need quotas because things are moving so slowly. But the real point that I was actually going to add is there are there is now increasing scrutiny on any type of senior position one has, not just politics. So if it's just thinking that women are getting put off politics or men, if you're running an organisation or you're high up, or you're running social care, or you're in a council with difficulty, or you are contributing and saying anything at all.
Sorry, can you hold the microphone closer because people can't hear?
Sorry, or if you're holding any position, you're looked at in terms of your finances, where you send your children to school, whether you have any offshore bank accounts, so the scrutiny is considerably greater. And for women in particular, you have all this clothes issue and how you look and all that sort of stuff, and where did you educate your children? But what I find, and really what I wanted to ask about the media, is, and I found in my experience, having gone through whatever I went through, that actually women journalists can be much more bitchy about women's achievements and also their looks than the male journalists. And I do wonder why that is, whether it is just to prove that they're just as good as the man who might be writing that story.
Sorry, can I?
Yeah.
Okay. So one of my male friends put that to me recently. He said, aren't just women writers more bitchy? And I actually countered this with women writers on papers and magazines and websites like mine are usually the ones who are chosen to write about other women or women's subjects because they're women. And so they're more likely to be writing about those subjects anyway. And, lots of journalists can be quite forthright and you know, if you want to use the word bitchy, it's just likely that if women are more likely to be writing about other women, then they're more likely to be writing horrible articles about women because they're just writing more of the articles about women. So I actually don't accept that women are more horrible about other women. I think it's a myth.
Sarah Vine on the kitchen last week.
Yeah, but she that is her job to write those kind of articles, and maybe it was nasty about Justine Miliband, but it was also nasty about Ed Miliband. And she is someone who is chosen by her editor to write those kind of cutting articles and funny articles about other people.
Okay, let's deal with the quotas first, and then we'll come to bitchiness.
I would just say it's also entirely possible that male politicians are more bitchy than female politicians, but I'll just leave that. Quotas, I think it's very complicated. So I think you start off quotas for what? Quotas of what? If you're in an industry, or say in the daily print lobby, Beth said you worked out it was 19% currently in the daily print lobby of 19% women as opposed to, what would that be, 81% men, out of a group of 80?
No, it's more like 150.
More like but sort of, so do you go from 18% to suddenly say 50%? Where do those people come from? In small industries, particularly in my industry, so the BBC sort of main pool of political correspondents, I think at the moment there are 10, without counting properly, probably at the moment I think it's about 3 to 7 or maybe 4 to 6. So in a new group of people, if one woman arrives, that massively suddenly changes it to 50-50. Quotas, who would decide? What would they look like? Would a lot of women, probably myself included, think that actually I don't really want to get a job because of a quota? But then on my own programme, we've got 4 presenters, 3 women, 1 man. Would we have a quota and say, well, we had to all sit down and look at our shifts and unpick that because that was wrong? So I don't really have a solid view on it, but I just think it's very complex, and every industry is very different. And if you said, okay, we're looking at engineering, where it's sort of 95 to 5, you can't always just say that and find an easy solution. And particularly media and politics, which are very small industries comparatively to manufacturing or finance or whatever, it's quite difficult to know how you would shift the dial without having all sorts of unintended consequences. But I'm not, I don't sort of have a position.
I think what's interesting in your question, if you say that this is the under 24s, that I find really surprising. Yeah. Have you got something you want to say about quotas?
Well, I'm going to stick with politics because the people in there represent us as elected politicians, and the observation I would make about Westminster is that the decision by the Labour Party to put in all-women shortlists has transformed their party. 100 women came in 97 under Blair's Babes. They've put 53% of women into marginal seats. They've got 33% now. They've got nearly half their cabinet as women. If there is a Labour government after this election, the political landscape will look very different. Now, I don't really want to give a view about what I personally believe about quotas, but what I would say is that Sarah Charles, who has done lots of work about representation in Parliament, her observation is, you don't have to do quotas, but if you don't do them, you will just get incremental change. And I think over the past 2 decades, what we've seen with the Conservative Party and Labour is the difference between some form of affirmative action and a decision to just have incremental change. The question is, as you go forward, does it ultimately make you less electable if you are not representing 50% of the population? And on business, Angela Merkel in Germany has now put quotas in, in Germany for women on boards. The government have done voluntary quotas here. The problem with it is, as Laura said, it's the pipeline. You can stuff a board full of non-executive directors, but they don't really have power in the way that a chief executive or a chief operating officer or a chief financial officer has. But if you haven't got a pipeline of people coming through, if you then just put a quota and go, well, you need 20% of executive directors of women in 10 years' time, a business has to adapt to that. So I think it is complicated, but I certainly think in business I think it's really complicated because you have to align people to the job and you have to make sure you've got a pipeline. but I think voluntary targets can certainly focus the mind on that. But in Westminster, I think there's, you know, plenty of people on shortlists that could be legitimately be put on a shortlist as a woman who are just as good as the men.
Well, it'll be interesting if there's only one Lib Dem woman after the next election.
Lib Dem woman? She's going to sit in the tea room going over to the Labour benches.
Well, it's interesting what you say about all women shortlists, because whenever you speak to women Tory MPs and Lib Dem MPs, they always say, oh, Labour's all-women shortlist transformed Parliament, the culture completely changed. But then they have to say that they're against them because their own parties aren't in favour of them. So lots of people do accept that it is a good thing, that it changed the culture.
I actually think there's a shift, because Maria Miller and Caroline Spelman, both who were cabinet ministers, Maria Miller was the Women's and Equalities Minister as well as the Culture Secretary, both of them have said, I know only since leaving office, that they think that some form of affirmative action might be necessary, but they only said it after they weren't in government.
Yeah. Well, the new Lib Dem president, who's a woman, Sal Brinton, was saying that if they have such an appalling, if the Lib Dems have such an appalling number of women after the next election, then they might consider bringing in all women shortlists.
A bit late.
Yeah.
So right in the back. No.
Really good debate. Sam Dowling from London-wide local medical committees. So I wanted to pick up on a couple of things that have been mentioned in passing. One's about class. I say class, not class, guess where I'm from. And the other one is about women being held to standards. So the question really is this. We've talked about reputation and parenthood, and we've talked about affirmative action. I, as a northern woman living and working in London, without a family, have concerns about the way that women are portrayed as they are candidates and as they continue through their political and their professional lives. Individual actions, skeletons, stories told about women in the public eye are often very different and told in a very different way from men. They're held to a very different standard, whether we're talking sexual, financial, professional misdemeanors or mistakes. I'd be really curious to know whether the panel agree and if they think there's something that can be done, and actually whether in their professional lives as journalists you've had to actually turn around to your editor and say, I don't think this is the story, because that's really tough, I think, if you're being asked to tell a story that's maybe not newsworthy, it's maybe more salacious. And then the related bit picks up on a session that was here a few weeks ago about mentoring. So talking about affirmative action and actually increasing the pool, what can be done to actually create that representation on the ground? So how can we get class back into Parliament?
Any thoughts, Anush?
What do you mean by class? Sorry, I didn't.
So I think increasingly...
Thank you. I think increasingly you need to be able to work the system. You need to have the right contacts to succeed within political structures. You need to be able to get ahead quite quickly and play the game. And I think the disaffection of people on the ground from the political process is evidence of the fact that that political game isn't maybe translating into the day-to-day life of the general population. You see a decline in party membership, you see a decline in voting. I think that connection needs to be reconnected.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Beth answered quite a lot of that earlier in the script.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that was necessarily just a women thing. I think lots of people feel detached from the way that politics is played out and the political process. And obviously that does put people off wanting to become candidates or get involved because they just see people spouting sound bites at each other on television in quite a robotic way. So we do need to change the way that our politicians need to work on the way that they represent themselves. But I don't know if that's necessarily just off-putting to women, that side of things. I don't know if you agree.
I'd say I think that's right. I think that that dislocation is wider than that, and what I would refer to, which I boringly always do, but in the Scottish referendum, when people believed that there was a vote that would make a fundamental difference to the fabric of their lives, there was turnout of 85%. So I don't think that this generation or the population of this country have given up on caring about the things that matter to their lives. What lots of people don't believe right now is that the current occupants over there, whatever they do, is going to make that much difference in the short term. So it's maybe not, and they feel dislocation in that sense. But I would absolutely have every confidence in the people of this country to make decisions and be involved in decisions when they believe it's going to have an impact on them. But I think dislocation is a problem. On one of the other points you made, I mean, just my personal recent favourite was when Rona Fairhead, who's an extremely accomplished businesswoman, was headlined in the Telegraph as mother of 3 becomes chair of the BBC Trust. But what was interesting is they were called out on it.
Yeah.
And I think 5 years ago, 5 years ago, they probably wouldn't have done. But are women held to a different standard, described in a different way? Yeah, absolutely. David Cameron and Nick Clegg both choose as positives to drop in the fact that they've got to do the school run. And I remember very early in the coalition, the first cabinet, it was, we're going to be revolutionary because guess what? Cabinet's going to start at 9:30 instead of 8:30 because we've got to do the school run. Tick, tick, tick. Wow, parent takes kid to school. But that's probably a good thing because it's the beginning of some kind of normalization. But does it probably stick in the throat of female politicians? I'll leave you to judge that.
But then there was also the Downing Street catwalk as well.
Oh,
Remember the one last year?
Yeah.
But there was also a huge comeback at that.
There was a lot of comeback at that. But, you know, in a way, also, you know, Shock Daily Mail does a splash of women wearing different clothes showing what women are wearing to work.
Just to pick up on this in social media as well. I mean, there has been some research. It was quite a small sample that did show bias to female politicians, that they were consistently had more negative connotations around them when they were written about in the press. I'm lucky because I work at the FT. We don't do those sorts of stories. You know, the idea that we would ever do a Cameron's catwalk, it just wouldn't happen. So, fortunately, I've never ever had to say to someone I'm not happy with doing that, and that is something I'm thankful for. The other thing, though, is I would pick up is on social media. I mean, it's not just the press that this happens to. I mean, Jenny Willett, after she appeared in that the documentaries on the House of Commons, you know these great shots for getting the buggy. I was just thinking, oh, that's a nightmare. And I was just like, oh God, welcome to my world. This just looks awful. And she had that hate mail on Twitter and stuff. People saying that she was unfit to be a mother, and she should be. That her children should be taken to social services. It's just really, you know, it's just, so it's not just, I guess I make the point, it's not just the press and the kind of Westminster bubble that does this, it's sort of the way in which somehow the public behave as well, which is quite worrying.
Okay, we're coming towards the end. Should we just take maybe two questions here, you and then you together, and then
I'm Naomi Eisenstadt. Anyway, I suppose what I want to do is go back to the affirmative action and the class thing, because I think we have to start thinking both and, not either or. And my analogy on it, because I'm American, is race, where I think affirmative action was enormously important in changing the way America looked. I really think it made a massive difference in terms of television, in terms of media, in terms of politics, in terms, you know, Obama didn't happen all of a sudden. But what I would also say is that it did nothing on poverty and black people. So, you know, so we've got, you know, the problem of black kids still being shot on the street. So the both and story is that there was a sense in America, tick, that's done, and a whole group of people got completely left behind. And I think that we are in danger of doing that on women if we don't think about the kinds of issues that were raised about, you know, who cleans our houses and who looks after our children, and who, because they're women too.
Hannah White from the Institute for Government. I just wondered whether any of the panellists had a comment on the proposal for a new select committee on gender inequalities to look at what civil service policies, what impacts they might have, and whether you have any thoughts on what that might do to visibility of gender issues in Westminster.
This was a recommendation from the APP, the All-Parliamentary Group report that Mary McLeod had put together, and they had a series of recommendations about the select committee, about changing the hours, about aligning parliamentary terms to school terms instead of just sort of randomly doing them in a way that nothing has come out of that report, absolutely nothing, apart from the comment that David Cameron made in the Commons the other day when asked about it, and he said about having a Women's Inequality Select Committee. And Parliament has changed hugely from those days where it was a gentleman's club, really, whereby parliamentary sessions started at 3 in the afternoon so a man could deal with his estate in the morning, and then he'd come to politics, and then he'd go and have a fine meal. And, you know, the hours have changed. There's a nursery. It's a much more modern house. But certainly, it seems to be that in that report, at least, Mary and her colleagues found serious barriers to getting women into politics. And so I can't help but think it could be only a good thing to actually really look at some of those issues and make serious recommendations and turn what was a talking shop around that report actually into maybe some positive action.
I think potentially it could be a good mechanism. I think select committees, it's so often dependent on who then sits on the committee and how how forthright they become. So I think it might work, but it's hard to tell.
Yeah, I think that's right. If you've got a high-profile chair who can get it in the news, then it's often more influential.
Yeah. Have we got room for time for one more question? Yeah. Okay, the gentleman there.
Just one quick comment and a question.
Sorry, what's your name?
My name's Hugh Edwards. People should realise just how far things have moved since 1979. I can remember in 1979, after Mrs. Thatcher became Prime Minister, people in the Labour Party saying, Mrs. Thatcher, she's nothing. She's only a woman. We'll soon sort her out. Once we have another minor strike, she'll collapse. She won't be there 6 months. How wrong could you be? But interestingly, she didn't appoint more female cabinet ministers, and a number of female MPs actually went down during her time. Yeah. The other point is, I always feel women have to be much tougher than men in any given situation, because they get whatever profession, get a hard time, verbal abuse and comments about their appearance, which you've heard. And really,
Have you got a question?
Isn't it much tougher being a woman than being a man? Contrary to
Never tried,
what everyone thinks.
And any other final questions here? Sorry, maybe next door.
Hello. It's a half-formed question, but
what's your name?
Oh, sorry, my name's Liz. Previously from Bangor University, but now the Cabinet Office. And it's something around motherhood. So we talk about politicians or journalists saying this, I want to go home and see the kids. I don't have time for this. And my question is, does this help to normalise sort of mother situations, or does it make us look not serious? And what can we do about that?
Beth, I think you're the most qualified.
So what you're asking me is whether or not you're allowed to say it. Does it make it normalised, or does it disadvantage
It's something I battle with, actually, personally. I think, shall I say, I'm applying for flexible working, I'll talk about my family. Or should I try and fight it out with the men on men's terms?
So I've got 2 children. I had one child in 2009. I had another one in the lobby in 2012. So I've got a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. So I've got quite a lot of heavy childcare, I would say. And I do think that it is difficult in that it stops you being as free to do your job as you might want to be. So, for example, I can't be down in the sports and social bar every night at 9 o'clock trying to pick off slightly drunk MPs to get a story, because so you have to work more effectively. The way I do it is I just have sort of red lines where I say I'm just taking my son to school and that's what I do, and before 9 o'clock I'm not doing anything. But I do think that it's challenging to keep going, and it's challenging to ask for, I don't even think they're concessions, but to actually just have an employer acknowledge that you have other responsibilities if you're the only person in the room asking to do it. And I would imagine that women tend not to, and I think it's very interesting that since I've been in the lobby, every woman that had a baby didn't come back to the lobby. They came back and then they went to a different job. I think that tells you something.
I think it's becoming more normal, and there are also fathers who want to do it. So I think we shouldn't, but I think it is still hard for people to say it. It is becoming more normal. But I also think that there is, for all, people have to say it. Because if you don't say it, it'll never change. And actually, that's not to minimise it, things being difficult and being hard if you're the only person in the room saying it, but also if nobody ever says it, then it doesn't change.
But it's interesting going back to your earlier point about Nick Clegg and Cameron sort of almost making a sort of virtue of it.
Because they believe there is political advantage in doing it, which tells you that they've clocked that the country wants to see people who look more normal. But did that drive other people up around the bend? Yeah, of course it did.
Yeah, well, it's interesting how male politicians want to talk about their children and doing the school run all the time, but women, like you said, are reluctant to talk about it. They don't know whether or not it will make them look more normal or whether it will make them look weaker than their male counterparts. So that's obviously a cultural problem, and I think the only way that can change is by having more women politicians.
There was always the thing that as a woman executive, you couldn't have pictures of your children on your desk, whereas a male executive, of course, you would have lots of pictures. I think I'm being told we have to end now. Thank you very much indeed for coming, and can you join with me in thanking a great panel, please?
Just before you all go, I wanted to thank Suzanne for chairing it as well, so thank you very much, Suzanne. Listening to that last exchange, I remember when Evan Davis was talking to me about whether he should be on Newsnight or not. One of the things he was worried about was the effect on his whippet, because he's got a whippet called Mr. Whippy, and the Today programme is very good news for whippets, because basically you're then at home for the rest of the day because you stop working by about 9:30. So that was one of the big conflicts he had then. So it's not just children. But anyway, so that was a good place to end.
We all have dogs on Newsnight.
There's been a lot of debate about quotas today, and what I wanted to just say was that one of the events we're planning in this series later on is going to be a debate about, do we need quotas? So if anyone's interested in participating in that, maybe they could let me or one of the IFG events team know. So that will be probably, we're going to take a bit of a break, but probably when we come back towards later in the summer, July or early September or whatever, then we'll do that. So thank you all very much for coming today.